I kept the cabin off every document I ever signed, not because I was hiding something shameful, because I understood, even before I could name the feeling, that some things need to stay protected. My wife, Loretta, she found that place with me back in 1987. We were driving through the Blue Ridge one October weekend, just the two of us, kids staying with her mother. We saw the hand-painted sign, "For sale by Ogre," nailed to a fence post, and we pulled over on a dirt shoulder without even discussing it. That was how we made decisions back then, together and fast and without needing words. The cabin sat on 11 acres outside a small town in Virginia, nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, a stone fireplace, a porch that looked out over a creek you could hear from the kitchen. We paid cash from savings I'd been setting aside for 7 years, and we put it in a family trust my attorney helped me structure. Off the main deed, off joint filing. Not because I distrusted Loretta. I trusted her with everything I had, but because we'd both watched her brother lose a rental property in a bad divorce, and we agreed that some assets live quieter when they're not easy to find. Loretta passed 8 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. I held her hand on the last night, and she told me to take care of our daughter and to not let the cabin go to someone who wouldn't love it. I promised her both things. My daughter's name is Nora. She was 31 when she met him. She'd been focused on her career for most of her 20s. She's an occupational therapist, works with stroke patients mostly, and I was proud of her in a way I never quite knew how to say out loud. She was sharp and principled, and she had her mother's way of reading a room. His name was Griffin. He came into her life through a mutual friend, some group dinner in Roanoke, and she called me that same night to tell me about him. I hadn't heard her sound that way since she was a teenager, describing a concert she'd been to, happy and rushed, and like she couldn't get the words out fast enough. I listened. I asked a few questions. I kept my concerns to myself. What were those concerns so early? Just instinct, really. Nora was a careful person. She didn't call me the same night she met someone unless something in her had already shifted. And any man who moves that fast into the heart of a careful woman, I've learned to watch that. I met Griffin 3 weeks later. He drove a truck that was newer than his income explained. He shook my hand a beat too firmly, the way men do when they're performing confidence rather than actually having it. He called me sir twice in the first minute, and then never again, which told me the respect was front-loaded. He asked about the house within 20 minutes of sitting at my kitchen table. Not the cabin, he didn't know about the cabin, but my house. How long had I owned it? Did I find the market in this area had held up well? Was I thinking about downsizing at some point? I said I hadn't thought much about it. He smiled and said, "Smart. No reason to rush anything." I started a notebook that night. Nothing dramatic. Just a yellow legal pad I kept in my desk drawer. I wrote down the date, what he'd said, and what I'd felt when he said it. I've kept notebooks my whole life. Engineering habit from 35 years working for a utility company. And I knew from experience that feelings you don't record have a way of becoming feelings you can't prove. They were engaged 14 months after that dinner. I walked Nora down the aisle in September on a vineyard outside of Charlottesville, and I smiled in every photograph because she looked beautiful, and because I knew that smiling was what the day required. That night, back in my hotel room, I added 4 pages to the legal pad. The marriage changed things quickly, not dramatically at first, subtly. The way water changes stone, you don't notice it happening, only the result. He moved into her apartment initially, and then they bought a house together. His name on the mortgage, a fact he mentioned at every family gathering as though it were an achievement rather than a basic arrangement. Griffin worked in investment consulting, which, the more I listened, seemed to mean he helped wealthy acquaintances move money around in ways that weren't always clearly defined. He had a decent income by most measures, but he spent ahead of it. That much was visible even without access to their finances. He started calling me more after the wedding, more than Nora did some weeks, stopping by on a Tuesday with no real reason, staying for 2 hours, asking questions that circled around my retirement accounts and my property without ever landing directly on them. He was good at it. Conversational and interested and easy to talk to if you weren't paying the kind of attention I was paying. One evening he mentioned, casually, that he'd been looking into estate planning for people in my situation. He said it would be worth talking to an advisor together, as a family. Make sure everything was set up efficiently. He used the word legacy 4 times in 10 minutes. I told him I appreciated the thought, and that I had an attorney I'd worked with for 30 years who handled all of that. His expression didn't change. That was the tell. Most people, when you close a door, show some reaction, a small deflation, a quick pivot. Griffin just nodded slowly, like he was filing the information, and changed the subject. I called my attorney the next morning. Her name is Patricia Elmore, and she's been practicing estate law in Roanoke for 30 years, and is exactly the kind of woman who has heard every version of every story. I told her I wanted to review the trust, make sure the cabin was airtight, make sure the language was current. She met with me the following week. We went through everything. The cabin sat cleanly in the trust, established before Nora was born, structured as a family asset with specific conditions. If Nora ever inherited it, it would come to her alone, not as marital property, which under Virginia law protected it from division in the event of a divorce. Patricia had always been careful about exactly this kind of thing. Is there a specific concern? She asked. Not yet, I said, but I want to be ready before there is one. She nodded and said she'd add a few additional protective clauses and have me back to sign. Meanwhile, Nora started calling less. I told myself it was normal. She was busy. She had her own life. Marriages create new rhythms. But I'd known my daughter for 31 years before she met Griffin, and I recognized the difference between busy and managed. She'd started explaining herself more, justifying small things. Why she couldn't make it to Sunday dinner. Why she'd had to cancel our standing Thursday phone call. Why Griffin needed her that particular weekend. People who are free don't spend that much energy accounting for their time. I kept adding to the notebook. I drove out to the cabin one weekend in early spring, just to check on it, as I did every couple of months, and I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and tried to be honest with myself about what I was actually observing versus what I was afraid of. Because those two things can blur when you're a father who's already lost a wife and can feel another loss forming at the edges. What I knew. Griffin asked too many questions about money. He isolated Nora's time in ways that were small enough to explain individually, but formed a pattern when you laid them side by side. He had twice that I'd witnessed, corrected her in front of family. Once about something she'd said, once about something she'd remembered, in a tone that was technically gentle, but was designed to make her doubt herself. What I didn't know, whether Nora saw any of it, whether she was happy, whether I was a father protecting his daughter, or a father who couldn't let his daughter grow up. I sat with that question for a long time, then I drove home and made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him. Not yet. Confronting a man like Griffin without evidence doesn't stop him. It just teaches him to be more careful around you. I was going to wait, and while I waited, I was going to document. And while I documented, I was going to make sure that whatever he was building toward, I was already on the other side of it. I hired a background check service. Not a private investigator, nothing like that. A legitimate research firm that does public record searches and financial history for a flat fee. It took them 3 days to send me a report. Griffin had been engaged before. A woman in Tennessee about 6 years before he met Nora. They'd never married, but they'd lived together for 2 years, and she'd filed a civil suit against him for recovery of funds. She said he'd convinced her to invest in one of his consulting arrangements. The suit was settled out of court. The terms were sealed. There was also a complaint filed with the Virginia State Corporation Commission. Not a conviction, not even a formal charge, just a complaint related to investment advice he'd given a retired couple in Lynchburg. The complaint had been closed without action, but it was there, in public records available to anyone who thought to look. I made copies of everything and put them in a file folder at the back of my desk. Then I waited. The call that changed everything came on a Wednesday afternoon in November. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no emergency. It was Nora, and she was crying quietly, the way she did when she was trying not to be heard crying. She said she and Griffin had been fighting, that he'd told her she was being financially irresponsible for spending money on a weekend trip with her two oldest friends, a trip she'd been planning for 6 months, that he'd said she needed to run larger purchases by him first, that when she'd pushed back, he'd told her she was lucky he managed their finances the way he did, because she didn't have a head for it. That's not true, I said. You know it's not true. I know, she said, and then quietly, he wants to meet with your attorney, Dad. He says we need to understand what your estate plan looks like. He says it affects our financial planning. I didn't say anything for a moment. He asked me to ask you, she said. I'm just telling you what he asked. Okay, I said. Tell him I'll think about it. I got off the phone and sat in my living room for a long time. The light was going outside. I could hear the neighbor's dog somewhere down the street. I thought about Loretta and what she would have said. She'd been warmer than me, faster to trust, but she had a line and she knew exactly where it was. She would have said, enough. I called Patricia Elmore the next morning. I told her what Nora had said. I told her about the Tennessee engagement, the complaint in Lynchburg, the pattern I'd been watching for 2 years. I told her about the notebook. You've been thorough, she said in a way that sounded like a compliment, but also like a warning. I needed to be, I said. We talked for an hour. By the end, we had a plan. I called Griffin that evening. I told him I'd be happy to meet, that I thought it made sense for us to have a conversation about family financial planning, and that I'd have Patricia there as well since she knew the details of my estate better than I did. He said that sounded great. He sounded pleased in a way he couldn't fully contain. We met on a Friday morning at Patricia's office in downtown Roanoke. Nora came too, which I hadn't expected but was glad about. Griffin arrived in that two-new truck wearing a blazer, carrying a leather portfolio like he was presenting at a board meeting. Patricia ran the meeting. She walked through the basics of my estate plan, the house, the retirement accounts, the terms of my will. Standard information, nothing he couldn't have guessed. Then he asked about the cabin. I've heard there may be a property outside the city, he said, looking at Patricia, not at me. I want to make sure Nora's interests are fully represented in your planning. Patricia looked at him over her reading glasses. The cabin is held in a family trust established in 1991, she said. The terms of that trust specify that it passes to Nora as separate property. It is not marital property. It would not be subject to division in a divorce proceeding. The room was very quiet. In fact, Patricia continued, folding her hands on the desk, I want to make sure you understand the legal distinction clearly, because it matters. Nora's interest in that property exists independently of her marriage. It always has. Griffin nodded slowly. The performance of patience. I see. And in the event that the trust were contested, it wouldn't be, Patricia said. It's been structured and maintained specifically to withstand that. He glanced at me for the first time since we'd sat down. I looked back at him and didn't say anything. The meeting ended shortly after. We shook hands in the lobby. Nora walked to the parking lot with me, and we stood by my car for a moment. She hadn't spoken much during the meeting. You knew, she said. I had a feeling, I said, but I needed to be sure. She was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after something clicks into place that you'd been refusing to let click. The woman in Tennessee, she said. Did you know about her? I told her I did. I told her about the background report. I told her I hadn't wanted to come to her with suspicion, that I'd needed facts, and that I'd needed them to be solid before I handed them to her. She cried, not the quiet, trying not to be heard, crying from the phone call. Real crying, in a parking lot in the cold, leaning against my car while I put my arm around her and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. She asked for copies of the report. She met with a family law attorney the following week. Virginia is an equitable distribution state, but because they had no children, because the marriage was under 4 years, and because Nora had documentation, from me, from Patricia, from her own growing record of things she'd started writing down after our parking lot conversation, the process moved more cleanly than these things usually do. Griffin hired an attorney who made noise about the cabin for about 6 weeks before realizing there was nothing to grab onto. Patricia had been building that wall for 30 years. He wasn't the first person to try to find a door in it. The divorce was final in the spring. Nora took a week off work and drove out to the cabin with me. We sat on the same porch where her mother and I had sat the first weekend we owned it. The creek sounded the same as it always had. She brought coffee, and I brought the old photo album from the box in my truck, pictures of her as a child out there, catching fireflies in the yard, learning to fish in that creek with her mother's patient hands guiding hers. She looked at each photograph for a long time. I'm sorry, Dad, she said. You don't owe me an apology, I said. He was good at what he did. That's not a reflection on you. You warned me, she said. Not directly, but I felt it. You weren't ready to hear it, I said. That's not the same as not listening. She nodded and looked out at the creek. We stayed 2 nights. We fixed the screen on the back door that had been coming loose since summer. We cleared some brush along the property line. We ate dinner on the porch both evenings and talked the way we used to talk, before everything got managed and explained and careful. On the last morning, before we packed the car, she walked down to the creek by herself. I watched her from the porch. She stood there for a while, with her hands in her jacket pockets and her face turned toward the water. I don't know what she was thinking, but I know what I was thinking. I was thinking about a woman who made me pull over on a dirt shoulder in 1987 without even saying a word, about a promise I made on a last night, about a yellow legal pad and 32 months of patience, and an attorney who builds walls that hold, about the fact that some things, if you take care of them, will still be standing long after the people who tried to take them are gone. The cabin is still ours. It always will be.